Are you looking for inspiration on a daily basis? Then check out Deal to Heal Teas. With our inspirational teas, you're sure to find something to inspire you. That's dealtohealteas.com. Put some inspiration in your situation. Wear inspirational tea and be inspired all day. Let's go to dealtohealteas.com. Again, that's dealtohealteas.com. Hey guys, if you're enjoying this podcast, then I know you'll enjoy the Girl Dad Discussion podcast. I'm your host, Ernest James, and I believe the relationship between a daughter and her father is one of the most important relationships a young lady can have. And therefore, my mission is to promote the daddy-daughter relationship by sharing the voices of girl dads to the world. So check out our podcast on every platform where podcasts can be listened to. And if you want to watch the podcast, check us out on our YouTube channel. Again, that's the Girl Dad Discussions podcast with your host, Ernest James. Hey guys, this is Ernest James, host of the Deal to Heal with E. James podcast. And I got a question to ask you. Could you buy me a cheeseburger? Better yet, could you buy me a value meal? Yes? Well, guess what? I don't need a value meal. However, for the cost of a value meal, you can support this podcast to keep us on the air. Just go to Patreon/Deal to Heal podcast and choose any one of the 3 tiers that's available. And if you just want to make a one-time donation, go to Cash App and make a donation to $EJames, the number 418. Make a one-time donation to the Cash App, or again, go to Patreon to support this podcast and keep us on the air. Thanks in advance. Be blessed. Welcome to Deal to Heal with E. James podcast. On this podcast, my guest and I will discuss topics and ways to help us to heal in every area of our lives. I believe that everyone can live a life that is happy, healthy, and whole. So I'm on a mission to help people to deal, heal, and fulfill. Deal with your problem, heal from the pain, and fulfill your purpose. Thanks for tuning in. Let's get to it. Welcome to the Deal to Heal with E. James podcast. I'm your host, Ernest James, and I believe that everyone can and should live a life that is whole, healed, and healthy. And therefore, I'm on a mission to help people to deal, heal, and fulfill, to deal with your problems, to heal from the pain, and to fulfill your purpose. Thank you guys once again for tuning in to the Deal to Heal with E. James podcast. If you haven't already, make sure you listen, like, subscribe, and share our podcast on all of your social media platforms. And also make sure you guys are checking us out on our new YouTube channel, the Deal to Heal Podcasting Network. We were formerly the Deal to Heal podcast, but we changed our name to the Deal to Heal Podcasting Network because now we are offering you more podcasts on our YouTube channel. So you have the Deal to Heal with E. James podcast will be there, but also our sister podcast, which is the Girl Dad Discussions podcast with myself, E. James, will also be there. And we also have 2 other podcasts that we are have coming up soon, and a couple more that we are producing. So again, make sure you guys go to the Deal to Heal Podcasting Network on YouTube and subscribe to our channel. We're going to be bringing you amazing podcasts for you guys to check out. And also, if you thought about starting your own podcast, you can get your copy of the ebook, Start Your Podcast Now, in only 3 steps. From ebooksbyejames.com. The link is in the description. Again, that's Start Your Podcast Now in only 3 steps that I wrote. It's an ebook that I wrote, basically telling you how you start your own podcast with little or no time and have it up and running in less than a day if you put in the work and follow the steps that I have in the ebook. So again, that's Start Your Podcast Now in only 3 steps. And you can get that at ebooksbyejames.com. The link is in the description below. All right. All right. Also, I'm going to tell you guys how you can win $100 from the podcast, but you got to stay until the end of the episode in order to get that information. So make sure you guys hang on, right? So also our product of the week, as you guys know, we are a self-sustained podcast, and the way that we pay our bills is by bringing you amazing products for you to purchase in order to support the podcast. So this week, our products of this week is our ebooks, not our ebooks, is our purpose planner and our purpose journal, right? It's a planner and a journal that both the script can be found in the descriptions. You can purchase them on Amazon because I believe you should journal in order to remember where you are and where you've been, and you should also plan for your future. So you guys can go to Amazon and pick up our purpose journal as well as our purpose journal and planner. The links are below in the descriptions, so make sure you guys go and check that out when you guys get a chance and support the podcast, right? So but we're gonna jump right in it today, just like any other day. Mr. Jeremy, how you doing?
I'm doing great this evening. Thanks for having me on the program.
No problem, no problem. The first thing I want to say is thank you for being here, because you could have been doing anything else with anyone else, but you're here with me and my listeners, and I want you to know I appreciate it. So thank you for being here. But we're gonna jump right into it, man. Do me a favor, introduce yourself to my listeners and let us know who you are and a little bit about what you do.
Sure. My name is M.A.N. Johnson. I am an author, public speaker, and digital content creator. And I speak and write about 7 topics. And those topics are health and fitness, Christianity, suicide prevention, relationships, race issues, overcoming pornography, and the last one is slipping my mind right now, but it'll probably come to me a little bit later. But 7 topics, I can only remember 6 at the moment.
Okay. Well, one of the topics that I want us to get into today that you mentioned was about, I think you said overcoming suicide?
Yeah, suicide prevention. Now remember, the 7th topic is actually kind of money mindset, like how to move from an underachiever mindset to an achiever mindset, and
Right.
specifically with an eye to building wealth. So that's the 7th topic.
Okay. All right. Cool. So I want to get into the suicide prevention, right? Because that is something that's dear to my heart, right? Because of my own experiences, and I've shared it on the podcast plenty of times, of me going through my own battle of depression, and at that time I was going through a divorce too. So depression, divorce, debt. I always say I was living a D life at that time, because it was like depression, divorce, debt. They just like a lot of stuff piled up on me, and on top of it all was the death of my mother-in-law at the time, and then the death of my own mother, right? And so that really put me in a bad space where I was having suicidal ideations, and contemplating possibly taking my own life, and was able to come out of that space, make it out of that space. So I won't go back into the whole thing again, because I know my listeners have heard me tell that story plenty of times. But because it's a situation that's dear to me, because number one, I had my own thoughts about suicide before my experience, and my pre-experience thoughts and my experience thoughts is quite different,
Yes.
it's quite different, and so it is a topic that's dear to my heart, and I do like to talk about it, because I know that we are dealing with it as men, especially dealing with depression and mental health issues in this time period.
Yes.
Is very prevalent, and so I like to talk about it, because if I'm open about it, then it opens the door for other men to be open about it. If I'm open with my experiences and the things that I've been through and how I made it, or even if I'm currently struggling with something, by having these conversations and open up these doors, it allow other men to feel free to share their own experiences. And so
Yes.
again, I want to talk about that a little bit and kind of get into that and your story, and how it pertains to you. So do me a favor, let's just go back a little bit,
Sure.
even before you start doing the work that you do now,
Hmm.
just a little bit about your own personal story of, who you were, and then what was kind of that major experience that happened to you to say, you know what, now I'm going to spend my life, pouring into others, writing these books for others to get,
Hmm.
and to become a speaker and all that, because I know there's a part of us, and a experience of us, especially those who work in this genre of speaking and
Yes.
podcasting and things like that. It's usually something that happens
Hmm.
that kind of changes us to be like, okay, now that I've kind of made it through that, let me help somebody else. So give us a little bit
Yes.
about who Jay was in the early years, and what was that transition thing that happened in your life that you was like, all right, now I'm going to spend my life giving back and helping others.
Good stuff. I grew up in a warm, loving home, and I love both my parents. They're still alive today. They did a great job, and they raised my brother and I. My younger brother, he was about 3.5 years behind me. Kind of excelled in school, and when I was really young, I was took up art, so I would draw all the time. Did some painting, won a lot of awards. I don't really draw or paint anything now, but maybe when the smoke clears and I have more time, I'd like to pick that back up. But I did a lot of that. Excelled in sports as well, and after high school, went into college, and that was the first reality check where in high school, if you were quote unquote smart, you didn't really have to study. So I didn't really know what it was to actually study. When I got to college, the question isn't really how smart you are, it is, are you smart enough to study? So I saw my first C's and D's, grades that I would, was not used to seeing. And more importantly, my parents were not used to seeing. So that led to some friction. But all the while, I learned some valuable lessons, especially in the area of relationships, which is kind of one of my talking points. But fast forward a little bit, while I was still in college, my brother committed suicide, and that, or died by suicide, and that hit me really hard because he and I got along unusually well. We rarely fought, if at all, and in a lot of ways, he was my best friend. And when he died, it led me to ask questions I had never asked before. And it also led to guilt, not just for me, but especially for my parents. Because for
Mhm.
me, it's one thing, I can only imagine their struggles. But to the extent that I know their struggles, there was definitely guilt where we're kind of thinking, okay, we should have done something, we should have said something. But we did recognize something was wrong about a year prior. He told me while we were shooting hoops at the house, he said, I'm not happy. And I said, okay, if you don't want to shoot right now, we can go do something else. But he said, no, I'm not happy. Now, when he repeated the same thing the second time, I rightly interpreted that as a kind of wholesale dissatisfaction with life itself. And
Mhm.
so I took it seriously. But honestly, at that time, I was, about early college, so maybe 19, 20, something like that. I had no tools. I didn't know how to deal with it. I did tell my parents, and we tried to do what we knew best to do at the time, which was it was limited, but I don't mean that to say that we just blew it off because we didn't.
Mhm.
We did spend, maybe at least a couple of weeks to a month kind of focusing on that. But he seemed to quickly get over it. And so I thought it was just a phase. But as the facts unfolded about a year later, I was fatally wrong. So with that, there was a period of time where I won't say I was in denial, but I was just trying to get accustomed to him not being around. And so I think of a joke like, oh, I got to tell Nate. And like, oh. And so then after that, there was a period of thinking that suffering earns good luck. And this is something that I write about in the book. We tend to sometimes think a false belief that suffering earns good luck. Now it trades on, or kind of is parasitic on something that is true. That is, suffering can produce great profit if used, if used to your advantage. But suffering itself does not necessarily earn good luck. So what does that look like? Well, I'm thinking, okay, something this bad happened to me. Now something really good is going to happen to me, and I'm going to win the lotto or something like that. So I was kind of looking around for that for maybe a few years. And of course, that good thing never came. And I guess, and some years later, probably the most decisive thing that happened in my life was conversion to Christianity, and through the good news of Jesus Christ. And from that point, I began to discover my gifts and my purpose, and that I had gifts and a skill set that could and should be leveraged to benefit other people. I wasn't quite sure how that would take shape yet, because at that time I was a FedEx driver, and I still drive for FedEx as a day job here even at the moment. But I knew that, and I got other men that I knew involved to try to help me think that through. And so after I guess I didn't mention, I dropped out of college. I mean, that's a long story, but sometime after my brother died. And I decided to pick back up going back to school, finish my degree, and then later got a master's. And after that, was kind of wondering how best to use that. And through listening to some online gurus, I came to the conclusion that there are gifts and skills now that other people need and that can benefit and help other people. And the best way to reach these people is going to be through the online means. That's going to be the speaking, writing, and podcasting, as it were. So, kind of a long story, but in short, that's what happened, and there's a lot more to it, but that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah. So I want to go back a little bit with a couple of things that you said. One of the things that you mentioned about your brother saying, that he wasn't happy. And two things I want to say about that. One is it goes to show sort of where your relationship was with him, that he could even say that, right? That he could even open up and say to you that he wasn't happy. Because one of the things that happened with me, which is my second part, is we're not having those conversations. And so in my story, and when I started the podcast, is when I actually started sharing about, me having those suicidal ideations and, really contemplating taking my own life. And it was after one of the episodes when I probably like the second time talking about it on the podcast, that one of my sisters, I have 5 sisters, and one of my sisters called me and was like, how did you go through all of that and none of us know? And I was like, because we're not having the conversations. We're not really checking up on each other like we should. We're not really, asking, after we ask how you doing and get the, that fake, I wouldn't necessarily say fake, but the automatic
subtext, or I guess we could say, kind of the greeting, like I'm fine, but it's a greeting, and the subtext is really, hey, I'm just greeting you back.
Response, it's like auto response. How I'm doing, I'm good. And I always say what we have to learn to do is follow up with the follow-up question about how are you really doing, know. And so I was telling my sister that, we weren't having these conversations, and we weren't checking up on each other like that. And so that was how I went through this whole time period, because it was a nice amount of time that I was in this space, and but your brother, number one, was able to speak out, and then not only able to speak out, but even comfortable enough to say to say, to you that he wasn't happy. And you mentioned about, you and your parents, doing some things, trying to put some things in place to help him.
Mhm.
And that's another reason why I like having these conversations, because it makes us address how prepared or unprepared we are to even
Mhm.
have the conversation. And then even
Yes.
if we want to have the conversation, to address it. Right. And so I remember having a conversation with I think either it was on another podcast that I was on, or it was on a podcast um, that no, I think it was another podcast called Mediocre Dads,
Mhm.
um, and the host name is Crew. I've had Crew on um, the Girl Dad Discussions podcast because he is a girl dad. But I was on his podcast, and I actually did 2 episodes on his podcast. The first episode was just kind of talking about my mission with the Deal to Heal, and then
Mhm.
but the second one, which we probably went maybe about an hour and a half talking, was all about suicide, right? Because
Mhm.
at that time when we recorded that, he had just lost a friend to suicide, and so we were having that conversation. But I remember him saying, because he's in the army, and one of the things he was
Mhm.
saying that they were asked by their commander or whoever the guy that was sergeant, whoever he was like, even if you guys were to have the conversation, like if you were to ask, one of your, team members how they doing, and they told you that they were in that space, how many of you will really be prepared to have that conversation, like to
Yes.
have some kind of information to give them, instead of just saying, okay, I'll listen. You know what I'm saying? And so
Yes.
so I know you mentioned about, even with your parents, that you guys didn't ignore it, but you
Mhm.
only could give them, give him what you guys had as far as
Yeah.
information wise. So how much of a part did that play, even in you writing the book, to talk about, this experience?
I think maybe two ways. The first way would be kind of thinking with an eye to the responsibility discussion that, okay, how much should I beat myself up for that? And how much should my parents beat themselves up for that? My answer to that would be very little, because given, what we knew at the time and what resources we knew were available at the time, we kind of did what we knew and did the best we could. And typically when you do that, it's kind of like, at least from my perspective, leave the rest to God.
Mhm.
So on that hand, it's like, okay, we need to give ourselves slack on that side. But when it comes to the other aspect or element or side, it's going to be, I'm writing this so that people who have lost a loved one can have some window into what's going on, like what the person's thinking, what the person's feeling, those kind of things. So I had to engage and interact with a lot of people struggling with this, and also some of the pressures that they're dealing with. I think about with what you mentioned earlier, like that. Hey, at least my brother and I were able to have a discussion. A lot of times the discussion doesn't even happen. This is one of the reasons I think why my friend and brother Tim Mulder plugged for his book. He wrote a book called Suffering in Silence. Now, his book is specifically about depression. He has one chapter in there on suicide, but he's addressing the Christian church community and trying to sound the alarm and saying, hey, pastor, some of your parishioners are suffering in silence, and you need to know what this looks like and feels like, and don't beat these people up. That is, treat them as though they're crazy or something like that. These people aren't crazy. These are natural responses to unnatural or uncommon trials and trauma situations. So that's kind of what he's trying to do in his book. And so the second side of mine, or that I'm trying to address and or get at, is to give the person something to hang on to, whether it's the person who has lost a loved one by suicide or has a friend or family member that is struggling with it, or if there's a person that he himself or herself is struggling with suicidal thoughts, how they can how the person can combat those and fight against those. So there are tactics and things like that, even down to breathing techniques and things like that that are in there as well.
All right, all right. I want to go back to one thing that you said about your friend's book and reaching out or bring it to the attention of the pastors about people suffering in silence.
Yes.
So I'm a PK, right? Which is
Okay.
for those
Okay.
that don't know,
Okay. Yeah.
pastor kid or preacher's kid,
Guess I'm
and
a grand PK. I think
yeah.
my mother's father was pastor. Yeah.
Yeah. So and I was a executive pastor for 10 years of a church that I helped start. But that's something that we often talk about, or I often talk about, is that separation of church and they say church and state, but not even church and
Mhm.
state, but church and therapy or church
Mhm.
and the help that you need. And a lot of times
Yeah.
and I'm not going to bash the church at all, but
Mhm.
I will say this: a lot of times we are taught to pray things away,
Mhm.
but you can't pray everything away. There are some
True
things that
that.
have to be addressed, and there's the spiritual aspect and then there's a natural aspect. And sometimes we spiritualize the natural. We
Mhm.
spiritualize too much, put too much spirit on the natural part, like the faith without works is dead. So
Yeah.
we lean too much on the faith and don't do the work. You know what I mean? And so I just want
Yes.
to say that because I'm a high component of therapy or
Mhm.
any kind of group support or whatever you need. I did bereavement support myself, and then it went on to even start a nonprofit organization that offered bereavement support, in our communities for that same reason, And so I definitely wanted to touch on that. Um, so one of the things that I was listening to what you were saying and even talking about your brother's experience and feeling guilty about, what had happened, and then even trying to come to terms with the part that you played even in the midst of that. So
Mhm.
when we're even dealing with something like that, there's a part that we play or could play in it,
Mhm.
because definitely after the fact, it always, kind of like, okay, what could I have done differently? What did I do? Well, but I know one of the things that you addressed, sort of from that even same aspect, is some things you're not responsible for, and I say that, we can do only what we know to do. And so, like you said, with your parents, you and your parents, you guys addressed it the best that you knew how. But at some point, it was like, okay, I did what I was supposed to do. You know what I mean? So I can't or won't hold myself responsible for that outcome, because I can
Mhm.
change the outcome. You know what I mean? I
Yeah.
can only change, the way that I address it. But yeah, I know that those of us that sometimes, have loved ones that pass, or, just in passing period, that have
Mhm.
loved ones that pass away, let alone, pass away by suicide, that there is a amount of guilt or just thoughts
Yes.
of, what did I do wrong, or why didn't I address, or why didn't I see the
Yeah.
signs, and so even from that aspect, you kind of address it about,
Mhm.
just being responsible for the part that you play in it, and then there's some part that you're not even responsible for. So let's talk a little bit about that, even that concept, and even coming to get to that understanding that, okay, this is the part that you play, but the other part you can't control.
Great, great question. We are responsible for four things, or I can put it in first person. I am responsible for four things: my thoughts, my words, my actions, my desires. That's it. My thoughts, my words, my actions, my desires. That's it. Now, there are maybe secondary responsibilities, we could say, like to consider the impact of my thoughts, words, actions, and desires, and accepting the consequences of my thoughts, words, actions, and desires as well. So, rob a bank and may say, hey, well, you're responsible for going to jail. Well, that's not a primary responsibility because I don't really control that. I can get caught, but I will. And when I do, I'm responsible to accept the consequences of my
Mhm.
thoughts, words, actions, and desires. So this is helpful, or this can be helpful in all areas, not just suicide. But when it comes to suicide, because it is such an acute topic and something that not only on the part of the one who is suicidal, because a lot of times there's shame. That's something I give a pretty long discussion to in my book, and we don't tend to understand shame all that well, and how shame does come as a byproduct of guilt when I sin, but it can also come even when I don't sin. So I may bear shame and it's not really my fault, so to speak. That does happen. A rape victim, for example, she's going to bear the shame. She really is defiant. It's not a fake thing. So she really bears shame. And it's helpful for us to understand what we are responsible for and what we're not. But yes, my thoughts, my words, my actions, my desires. So, for example, in the case of my brother, well, I wanted him to be helped. I didn't want him to die. And I was thinking about trying to help him. In other words, there was no ill will, neither myself nor my parents. We didn't egg him on, or we didn't rile him up. We didn't ridicule him. We didn't make him feel like less of a person or less of a family member for even expressing these things. So all our intentions were good, and and that's going to be kind of thoughts, desires, things like that. We were well intentioned, and we gave thought to how we would speak to him in ways that we thought would be helpful. And with what we did what we thought was helpful. So in that sense, what we said and did, we're in the clear on that. Now, what couldn't we control? Situations, circumstances. We can't control other people's thoughts, words, actions, and desires.
Mhm.
So now that's a biggie, because we will, sometimes try to control them. Hey, can you change my son? He's tripping, or whatever. Or can you change my spouse? In some cases, she tripping. Those kind of things happen. Like, no, that's not your job. Now we can invite people to change, but we can't. We're not the deciding factor in whether or not they change. So when those categories are clear, that can really help us avoid unnecessary guilt. And that can help us to zero in on the things that actually are our responsibilities. That's the power in it. Recognizing those things and keeping those categories clear. Because we can waste a lot of time on feeling guilty for things we had zero control over. And, I can't believe this happened, or what have you. But that was not your responsibility. Like, uh, those are things we really need to give thought to and take great care with. So those are some things that I try to unfold in the book. We're responsible for our thoughts, words, actions, and desires. Those four things.
Yeah. And I know it's kind of hard sometimes for people to really come to terms with that. Like I said, for even when you have loved ones that pass away from natural, uh, I wouldn't say natural because nothing's really natural when you pass away,
Mhm.
uh, but from circumstances, and then with suicide, it's a whole another element to those circumstances. And I remember having a conversation somewhat recently with a friend of mine who uh, lost a friend of hers to suicide, and having a conversation with her and her saying, "Why didn't I see the signs?" or why
Mm.
didn't I do more? And I was, kind of walking her through the conversation of, what did you know? What didn't you know? And what did
Yes.
you do? And it's
Mhm.
like, no, you did your part. You did what you were supposed to do, and it was like you mentioned earlier, you know, sometimes we don't see the signs, and because
Mhm.
sometimes we don't show the signs. And even with my conversation with my sister about me, and I was saying, well, when I was going through that time period, I wasn't walking around with a sign saying, I think I want to kill
Mhm.
myself today. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? But when I was around my family and everyone else, I, you suck it up and you put on a smile and you go through like everything is okay. And so you don't show those signs, and even in her, my friend's situation with the friend that she lost, she was married, young children, career, everything from the outside was like, oh, she had it going on,
Mhm.
but yet and still she was dealing with something that took her to that place that she decided, that she would be better off not here. And,
Mhm.
and I'm like, well, you can't take her decisions as a reflection of your decisions,
Yes.
because you were her friend, you were there, the part that you played, you did your
Mhm.
part, and she didn't share that part with you. She didn't share that she was going through, in that space with you. So you didn't even have known that that's what it was,
And
so you
I'm
handle it.
glad that I'm glad that you're bringing this up because an important thing that I just thought about is that had I known then what I know now,
Mhm.
there would have been more of a fullness to my responsibility because I would have been responsible for the knowledge that I have
Mhm.
and that to be deployed in whatever intervention that we would take. So there were quite a few warning signs that my brother did give that I know now to be warning signs. I mean, case in
Mhm.
point, he gave me his favorite piece of chain medallion, his favorite piece of jewelry the night
Yeah.
before. He even some things that at the moment I thought were strange. He and I were supposed to go out. He had decided at the last minute to stay home. Now that was nothing new, but what was new and strange was we both cut our hair, and so I cut my hair, and he had cut half of his hair, so like he had like half a beard, and he just stopped, and I thought that was strange. I'm like, why didn't you finish your haircut? Like, oh, I'll finish it later. Like, okay, you never do that. Like, so so he did that, and I'm kind of arguing with him about his jewelry. I'm like, I don't want your favorite piece of jewelry. He like take it. Like, okay, fine. So those were clear warning signs.
Mhm.
And now, or given what I know now, there would have been. What I'm trying to say is my responsibility now would be a little bit different, though the intentions and everything would be the same because now I know more. So this is not a license to just, oh, that's them. I have no responsibility to them, that kind of
Mhm.
thing. And there's clear warning
Mhm.
signs, and they're warning signs. It's just, up, not my problem. No, there is a responsibility there, but it's going to be proportional to, what you know at the time and things like that. So I just wanted to kind of make that clear.
Yeah, yeah. Because like we say, oftentimes hindsight is 2020. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? So when you're looking back, because I always like, oh, I didn't see that, or I should have saw that, or I should have reacted differently. And the truth is, you acted the way you acted because that's what you knew at the time. And then there is, I believe, for those of us who choose to take it, there is a responsibility that we have now that we know. And
Yes.
so with that same friend, we last year actually we had our first in-person event around suicide prevention, and we was able to share the stories, and even had another speaker that's a friend of mine who talked about uh, paying attention to the signs, because he talked about his experience with his daughter, um, when I think she was like 18 or 19, and he noticed she had a tattoo on her arm that said "stay." And so he asked her about it, and she told him that she was contemplating suicide and everything. And he was like, "Well, what are you going through? That's making you feel like this?" And she said, "Dad, it's not now. It's when I was 9."
Mm.
And
Wow.
so that was just a whole experience for him. It was like, okay, what was I doing, or what was going on that my 9-year old is thinking about taking her own life? And I didn't know. Not only did I not notice it when she was 9, but now she's like, I think like 19, 18, if not in her 20s, that she's now telling me about it. I haven't didn't notice it at all, like over the last 10 years, and it was like, so he was able to give from his point of view as a parent, and really start going through those things of uh things to look for, like paying attention to the signs, like you say with your brother, giving away the things that mean the most to them, you know what I
Yes.
mean, or just behaviors that's unlike them, like to have a haircut. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, and then of course, like I said, hindsight is 2020. Now
Mhm.
you're looking at it and you're like, okay, I can see the signs all along the way. But in the midst of it, it was like you're walking beside them and you don't see it. And so I think that's important for us to realize, and that's why I like to have these conversations,
Mhm.
because it makes us, now that we know, now that we're talking about it, now that we're addressing it, if we walk away and do nothing about it, if we walk away and don't find out what information that we can have to help the next person, or don't share our stories, then that responsibility is on us.
That's a
You know what I
problem.
mean?
Yeah.
And so that's something I really feel strongly about. That we go through some things, and God allow us to go through some things so that we can be able to bring life and bring help to the next person who may be experiencing those same things, which is the whole premise of this podcast.
Mhm.
To bring those issues, bring those experiences to the forefront, that says, if you're dealing with this or know somebody who have, this is how I dealt with it, this is how I got over it, and bringing it to the forefront. And suicidal ideation, and suicide prevention, again, something that's very dear to my heart because of my own life experiences. And I talk about the Girl Dad podcast, and that was the thing that kept me here, was my daughter. Because
Mhm.
out of all of that I was going through at that time, the one thing that I had to say to myself, what would happen to her if I'm no longer here? And that was the one thing that I held on to kind of get, help me to make it throughout that process. And so, I just want to share, that with everyone, so that now that we're having these conversations, now that they brought to the forefront, we can have these conversations more and more, and really get into it. So I got one last question
Sure.
before we get out of here. And we talked about the coming to terms with the responsibility that we have and a part that we play. But sometimes, even on the backside of that responsibility, I think there's a amount of pressure sometimes we feel, um, to do something about it or to not do something about it. It's like sometimes we're kind of torn in this space of, where do I go from here? With this information or with this life experience, and not just even pertaining to suicide, but just life in general. When we're
Mhm.
faced with a life experience that changes us, then we have to come to grips, like, okay, now what do I do with this? And so one of the things that you talk about is how, just pressure relates to your growth, that
Mhm.
you're going through as an individual. So could you hit us a little bit on that, and how we even come to terms with that growth and that pressure that we feel in the midst of whatever our situations are, and how we can use that to our benefit?
Sure. It's ironic. I was just talking with a young guy a few hours ago about this, and I was thinking about, for people who exercise,
Mhm.
there are really strange things that are going on. We don't think about it as strange, but it's really strange. Imagine somebody would be such a masochist that they would purposefully put their body through intense pressure, like they choose to do it. Imagine that. Like, I'm going to put all this weight on my chest and try to push it up. I mean, we'd almost think it's crazy if we didn't know better, right?
Mhm.
Like, why would anybody choose pressure for themselves? It's not as though it feels good. It doesn't. But we know that the result of that over time, if used properly with proper form, causes our muscles to grow. And overall, our bodies will be healthier. And we even often may feel better after a workout.
Mhm.
And so this is why we do it. It's not with an eye to the set itself, but it's with an eye to what it can produce if used properly. I say when used properly because proper form is essential. If the form is used improperly, your muscles can be severely torn and you can damage your body in a number of ways. So it has to be used properly. Well, that kind of pressure is not the only kind. And it's not as though this only works for exercising. It can also work for other types of pressure that come into our lives. The loss of a loved one, the we could say friction at work or something like that. Maybe you lose your job, or maybe you're losing your house. It could be any number of things. You have creditors calling and you don't know what to do because you don't have the money. It could be somebody getting bullied, all kinds of different pressures. And these pressures, one thing we have to do is not lie about it and act like, oh, I like this or this is good. No, we don't. I mean, not all pressure is bad, but
Mhm.
sometimes it is bad. Sometimes it may be something painful. Someone in an abusive relationship or something like that. The abuse is really bad. We need to call it what it is. But at the same time, we can see, okay, this is an opportunity to grow as well.
Mhm.
But the question is, how can I use this with proper form so that I do grow? And that's where our perspective becomes very important. We have to see it for the opportunity that it is. And normally we don't. We tend to do things like it's easy to kind of slip into some pride where we get into a competition, like my suffering is worse than yours or whatever. I mean, I've heard this with parents that have lost children, like, our child can die by suicide. Our child died by suicide. Well, our child was 2. Well, our child was 42. Okay, well, ours was still a little toddler and, just a precious little child. Oh,
Mhm.
but our son, we had 42 years to kind of get used to him. And it's like, okay, it's not a competition. As one guy said, I can't remember his name, but I quote him in the book, suffering is not a competitive sport.
Mhm.
But we can't acknowledge that there's a unique quality that accompanies each measure of suffering. So we don't want to kind of flatten it all out. And, that's where people, maybe somebody had some other kind of trial and then they act like they knew exactly what you were going through when you were having suicidal thoughts. Like, no, it doesn't work that way. There is a unique quality that accompanies your measure of suffering. But um, it's not a competitive sport. So we need to humble ourselves and realize that we all suffer, albeit to varying degrees,
Mhm.
because the world can be unpredictably bad. In Christian circles, we call it the fall. Um, but and also I can be unpredictably bad. That's where I'm going to surprise myself sometimes with the bad things I think, say, do, and desire. Right? Like, oh, I can't believe I said that. Can't believe I did that. What happened?
Mhm.
Well, we need to own it. I did do it. Let's not deny it. Like, no, it was somebody else. Well, she didn't make me. No, I did it. I need to own it. But there's also opportunity for forgiveness. So with pressure, it's going to be to see it for an opportunity. I guess